Tony, you'll be, are you going to be running the video on your screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to have with us tonight John Edward Ventre of Cincinnati. Known John for a long, long time with a big gap in between because of my obligations at home. And John's contributions to astronomy are simply unbelievable. He spent a half century as a public educator in astronomy and as a supporter and savior, really, for the Cincinnati Observatory, which you will see in a moment. He spearheaded the effort that resulted in the observatory being named a National Historical Landmark in 1997. The telescope housed there was the second largest in the world at one time and saw first light in 1904. It has a storied history. And he saved it literally from the wrecking ball. The university, ultimately, thanks to his efforts, leased it to the Cincinnati Observatory Center in 1999 on a 40-year lease, $1 a year, and saving the observatory under the care of the center. John became the first executive director of the center and served on its education committee for 19 years, served on its executive committee for 9 years, and was also secretary of the organization. He gave and has given 20 hours a week of volunteer work at the observatory for over 20 years. It's like $1 million in free donated time that he's given to this labor of love of his at the observatory. He's a very, very highly skilled master in the field of antique telescopes also, which helped him actually track down the person who stole a lens from the observatory. He was able to track it down. It had been donated to another observatory, and he'll tell you about that a little bit later. His speaking and public outreach has extended to scout troops, historical tours of the observatory every Sunday, to senior groups, to historical societies, to the University of Cincinnati, University, and Evening College, Mount St. Joseph University, Xavier University, iSpace, the Cincinnati Nature Center, and the Cincinnati Park System. He's also been an officer, former vice president and secretary of the Cincinnati Astronomical Society. He's also a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society in the UK. He's a former Great Lakes Region representative and national council member, served 8 years on the League's council, and he has co-authored 6 books on astronomy teaching and education, and also on the Cincinnati Observatory and its history. So it's my pleasure to introduce the man that I had the pleasure to participate in presenting the Great Lakes Region's Hans Baldauf Award just about a month ago, and richly deserved. So John, thank you for joining us tonight, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure being with you guys. I recognize at least one face there, Mr. Mitch. Hello, Mitch. Mitch arranged a tour for your society to come to the observatory. I can't remember how many years ago that's been, maybe 15, 12 years ago.
Yeah, I can't believe you remember that, but that was a very storied visit that I made with you that time. You were the perfect host.
Yeah, and I don't know if any of the people that's on screen tonight were in none. Okay, all right.
I wish they had. They were all people that I didn't even know who they were.
Okay.
They came out of the woodwork just to go to the observatory.
Well, Chuck asked for some kind of a program tonight, and my favorite program is a tour of the observatory, and I would really love to give that to you live, but unfortunately that's not going to happen. So one of our past presidents videoed me doing a tour, and we said, well, let's just play the video. I think it's a half hour, if I remember. From Chuck, does that sound about right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, 29 minutes.
So I guess let's play the video. Then we do a question and answer. Then I think Chuck had some questions. He wants something about John Quincy Adams and the story of the stolen lens or something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So who's going to hit the button?
All righty. Can everybody see my small windowed video up now?
Not yet. Not here.
Okay. Now, yes,
Coming.
Yes, there we go.
Here we go.
here we go. Let me put it in full screen. Give it a second to catch up.
You're not on full screen yet.
Yeah, give it a second.
There we go. Perfect.
Cincinnati Observatory. We'd like to conduct a historical tour for you today. Our storyline begins about 1809 on the banks of the Ohio River south of Louisville, Kentucky. A young boy was born, Ormsby McKnight Mitchell. Very unusual name. I'd never met anybody named Ormsby before. Unfortunately, he was only about 3. His father died. Living a rough life for the family back then. Mother could not afford to keep the family up, a very large family. So she relocated the family up to the Cincinnati area and then to Lebanon, Ohio. You might recognize that as the home of the Golden Lamb restaurant, the oldest in Ohio. Well, upstairs in the Golden Lamb are various rooms you can eat in or sleep in. And all the rooms are named for the famous people. Of course, one of them is named for the hero of our story, Ormsby McKnight Mitchell. Another room for the gentleman in the portrait right behind me. We'll get to him in a few minutes. As Ormsby was growing up in Lebanon, he was essentially what we call today homeschooled by his much older brothers. He reached the age of about 12 or 13. At that age, he was truly an exceptionally fine young man, was an expert at mathematics, could read and write many of the foreign languages, including Latin and Greek. And at that age, 12 or 13, he declared himself to be independent, left home to support himself, working as a clerk in another city, and add financial support back to his family. By the time he was 15, he had heard that he get paid for going to school. He loved education. And the school was West Point, the premier academic institution in the country. At that time, he was the youngest man to get appointed to West Point. He was still only 15 years old. But he could not afford the stagecoach ride to go 700 miles from Cincinnati to New York to get into West Point. So he essentially walked to the East Coast to get into West Point. He used some of the canals on his way up to West Point. The year that Ormsby got to West Point was 1825. That was the same year that this gentleman, President number 6, John Quincy Adams, was starting his presidency. But before he was president, but many other services to the country, he was our country's first minister. Today we use the word ambassador to Alexander I, Tsar of Russia, who had the world's largest telescope, was an expert at astronomy. He taught John Quincy astronomy. Quincy had a passion for astronomy the rest of his life. Every day in his diary, he would record what he'd seen in the sky naked eye or with his handheld telescope. The same year that Mitchell got to West Point, 1825, John Quincy became president. At his inaugural address, his challenge to Congress, he challenged Congress to build the country's first national observatory. He failed in his attempt. One of the reasons he failed was that the state rightist movement was quite strong at that time. They did not want to give money or power to the federal government, and the National Observatory would have been under the federal government. They wanted to keep everything at state level control, almost the opposite as we have in our political situation today. In America, we essentially had no professional observatories. Europe and Russia had over 130 operating observatories. When Ormsby McKnight Mitchell graduated from West Point 4 years later, he was so good at mathematics, he became an assistant professor at West Point teaching mathematics. Then eventually he surrendered his commission, returned to the city of Cincinnati, where he taught himself law, but unfortunately couldn't find any clients. That did not work out well for him. Then he started surveying because he was trained as a surveyor at West Point, and his father was a surveyor. He surveyed the first railroad coming into Cincinnati, the Miami Railroad. If you know where the Loveland Bike Trail is, that's the path of the old Miami Railroad. He had a major hand in any railroad coming in or out of the city until he actually died of yellow fever, Civil War. Our storyline now goes up to 1842 in Cincinnati, population approximately 50,000. According to some statistics, the fourth largest city in the country at the time. There was a group of people called the Society for the Promotion of Useful Knowledge. I think we need to resurrect that society again in our own environment. It was a self-help organization, and they offered Mitchell the opportunity to lecture to the citizens. He started his lecture in his lecture hall, overflowed that. Then he moved the lecture to the Wesley Chapel, which seated 1,200 people. It was on Fifth Street, right where Procter & Gamble's garden is today. Overflowed that. And at the end of the lecture series, we suspect, prompted by Mitchell, they essentially said, well, why could we? That particular period. Yet surprisingly, within only 3 weeks, over 300 people raised their hand and they wanted to be a part of the society. We now have their names inscribed on the original charter. In the left column, center column, and right column, it's actually a litany of who's who of old Cincinnati. And by the time the telescope arrived a few years later, there were over 700 members in the society. And we believe this is the first time that selling shares for membership was used to found a private or a public institution. So with his funds, he went to Europe to acquire a telescope. They didn't make telescopes of significant size in America at that time. He eventually ended up in Munich, Bavaria, in 1842. He stopped at the house of Meridian, and then got the second or third largest telescope in the world. The Tsar of Russia had the largest. At that time, it was just a lens that was hand ground. He had it tested. It was a perfect lens. He said, that's what we want for the Cincinnati telescope. It took 3 years to 1845 to complete the telescope, ship it across the Atlantic Ocean to New Orleans, up the Mississippi River, up the Ohio River, and in Cincinnati, April 1845. Well, between 1842, when he got back from Europe in 1845, Mitchell was responsible for designing and building the observatory. So the president of the society at the time was Judge Jacob Burnett from Bernard Woods fame. And Mitchell decided to invite the now ex-president, the former president, John Quincy Adams, to town to lay the cornerstone of the observatory. Quincy was in the House of Representatives, 76 years old, not in good health. His family did not want to come to town. We have a handwritten letter by John Quincy Adams displayed at the observatory, where he essentially is saying, I'm on my way. If I'm delayed, it's not my fault. But what we don't have displayed, and probably should, is what he put into his diary. He said, I'd rather be known as a man who came to Cincinnati to lay the cornerstone of the first observatory than for being president of this great land. John Quincy easily accepted the invitation to come to town. It took him 2 weeks to get here. He was staying with his son in Boston. He used one of those newfangled devices of the day called a railroad from Boston to Lake Erie, a steamship across Lake Erie to Cleveland, a canal packet from Cleveland to Columbus, Ohio, and then a stagecoach from Columbus to Cincinnati. Each night he stayed over at some place. The last night he stayed over at the Golden Lamb restaurant, and that's why they have a room upstairs in the Golden Lamb restaurant named for the John Quincy Adams room. On November 9, 1843, ceremony date for Adam to lay the cornerstone. The city shut down for a day. A parade over a mile long going on 6th Street up this hill east of downtown called Mount Ida. Allegedly it was called Mount Ida because there was an old woman named Ida who lived on the hill. She used to do the wash for the soldiers in Fort Washington along 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Street. And according to legend, she lived in the trunk of a huge old sycamore tree. Quaint story, but evidently a true story. Unfortunately, this day it was a horrible rainy day. As the citizens were coming up, marching up this muddy hill to the top of Mount Ida, it was so bad that President Adams just gave a very, very short dedication speech, but repeated his lecture the next day in the Wesley Chapel, the same chapel that Mitchell started the Astronomical Society in a few years prior, which seated 1,200 people, but this day 3,000 people squeezed in to hear him give a talk. Mount Ida became Mount Adams because the next day the city named the hill Mount Adams in his honor. Here's an old photograph of the area of the particular period where Mount Adams was shown literally on top of the hill there, and then the telescope that was erected into the observatory, shown in this photograph right here. This is the length of the tube of the telescope. The lens then is at the top. Professor Mitchell at the bottom of the telescope using the eyepiece. The telescope is mounted on a stone pier. Then the main axle of the telescope, or the polar axle, points up to the north celestial pole where the star Polaris is. As soon as the telescope was erected into the observatory, Mitchell started using it. Did just great astronomical work. But the city of Cincinnati was becoming industrialized, doubling in size in about every 10 years. To heat and fuel it, they started burning soft coal instead of wood. And the byproduct of that soft coal was thick, black, sooty, yucky smoke. In very short order of time, the basin of the city in Mount Adams became useless as an astronomical site because of the smoke pollution. He also had 30 and 40 paddle wheel boats lined up on the Ohio River right on the foot of Mount Adams, belching out smoke of the smokestack. By the 1870s, the smoke pollution downtown was so bad that the board of directors of the Astronomical Society decided they were going to close the observatory. And they also thought at the same time that a city of our size should have a university. So they decided to start the University of Cincinnati. If you look at the last board of directors of the Astronomical Society, at this time the president of the society was Alfonso Taft, father of President Taft. And the board of directors at the University of Cincinnati, many of them were the same individual, were friends or colleagues of one another when the university started. So they decided to close the observatory on top of Mount Adams and then move the observatory to a new site under the auspices of the university in an area that was named Mount Lookout, about 5 miles east of downtown Cincinnati. Behind me is the building they decided to build. It was built in 1873, designed by architect Samuel Hannaford, and this is the first significant building he designed other than some homes. The building cost $30,000, and John Kilgore, one of the board members, was very influential in funding that. He paid $10,000 for the building. He donated the flat 4 acres upon which we're standing. Then his son, Bayard Kilgore, several years later, donated 10 additional acres, so there was eventually 14 acres on campus at the new society in Mount Lookout. By 1904, the director of the observatory, at this time it was Jermaine Gildersley Porter, decided to acquire a new telescope, a 16-inch diameter Alvan Clark refracting telescope. So the original telescope that Mitchell acquired then was moved from the Mount Lookout building, the observatory, and then put into this building right behind me, the 1904 building. In 1904, it was just a round observatory, very small lobby, and then a few years later, definitely by 1912, they added the wings of the building. When the telescope was moved from Mount Adams to Mount Lookout, the only item of the old observatory that was moved into the new site was a cornerstone that John Quincy laid in 1843. On one face, to the left face, was the original inscription, Cincinnati Astronomical Society, founded May Anno Domini 1842. And then when they went to the new Mount Lookout building, they inscribed the second face of the building. This cornerstone was laid by John Quincy Adams, November 9, 1843. Removed and relayed in Roman numerals 1873. We're now going to go into the smaller of the two observatory buildings, the Mitchell building, which houses the original telescope that Mitchell purchased in 1842. Well, this is our pride and joy telescope, the oldest public, some people say professional telescope in America, purchased in 1842, arrived in Cincinnati 1845. Then when it went on to Mount Adams, then in 1870s, it came out to this site in the other building, and then to this building, the Mitchell building, the smaller of the two observatory buildings in 1904. Telescope is made with wooden tube, Brazilian mahogany. And this observatory has a dome on top of it. The dome is to protect the telescope from the elements and the people who have to work here. But then the light from the moon or stars, whatever we're looking at that particular night, comes through the dome slit that we just opened, and then goes into the lens of the telescope at the top of the tube. When the lens acts as a prism, bending the light is bent into the shape of a cone, like an ice cream cone of light, coming all the way down the tube, getting skinnier, until you come to about where the tip of my thumb is. A virtual image is formed or produced of the object we'll see in the sky, but the image is very, very small. Now, you need to magnify that small image, and we use a fancy magnifying glass. We call it an eyepiece or an ocular. Each eyepiece or ocular magnifies a different amount. So we put the eyepiece into the eyepiece holder, and then we can magnify the object we see in the sky. Well, to use a telescope, you just literally grab it, aim it, and point it at the particular object you see in the sky. You sort of shotgun over the top of the tube, get it close to the object, and then you bring your eye to this brass telescope on the side called a finding telescope. It gives you a very wide field view of the sky, very low magnification. And down where the eyepiece is, there's the crosshair. So you put the center of the crosshair in the center of the object you see in the sky. Then when you bring your eye to the main telescope, looking through the eyepiece magnified, the object is in the field of view, highly magnified, very, very beautiful. Now the telescope is mounted on this pier, a cast iron pier. The pier goes down to the basement on a pile of rocks, down to bedrock, so it's solidly mounted on the earth. Well, we are riding on the earth, a big ball, a big globe. We are rolling in this direction, which is east, about 750 miles an hour. We can't quite perceive how fast we're going, but that's how fast we're going. It wasn't until about the 1950s when an electric motor was installed to replace the mechanical drive system. We have plans eventually on replacing the electric motor with the original stored mechanical drive. Everything had to operate mechanically, including using this boom rope and pulley to open up the shutter. So to open up the shutter, you just pull down on the boom rope and pulley, the shutter very easily slides open. Well, once we have the shutter open, because the object in the sky is drifting typically from east to south to west across the sky, we have to move or reposition the shutter to keep up with the object across the sky. There's no motors, no electricity here in 1904, so we had to use a mechanical device called a crank. And we have a crank here on the wall, and astronomers or the people who assisted the astronomers would put their hands on the crank, and just by turning the crank, the whole dome turns. You can go either direction, one-handed, very, very easy to do. You're turning tons and tons of sheet metal up there. After looking at the Mitchell telescope, we're now going to return to the 1873 building, the original building on the Mount Lookout site, to look at the new telescope, the 1904 Alvin Clark and Sons. After Arnold McKnight Mitchell died of yellow fever in the Civil War, the president of the Cincinnati Observatory Society, Alfonso Taft, Father President Taft, and the other second astronomer, and they brought in this gentleman, Cleveland Abbey. As soon as Abbey came to town, he experienced the same problem as Mitchell, that is, smoke pollution from the burning soft coal downtown produced thick, black, sooty smoke. You could not do astronomy on top of Mount Adams. So Cleveland had another idea. He had an interest in meteorology. And by this time, the country had stretched telegraph lines out at least as far as Denver. He would correspond telegraphically with all the major cities in the country, essentially asking, "What is your weather?" And from the telegraph reply, he noticed there was a pattern. What the weather was in one area of the country west turned out to be the area of the country's east weather the next day. Therefore, Cleveland Abbey is what we call the father of American weather prediction. President Grant heard what he was doing. He liked the idea. He thought that would be a secret tool to be able to predict weather in the war. War is one going on after the Civil War. So he would, Grant then transferred Abbey up to Washington, D.C., where he reported the Department of the Army Signal Corps. War was going on at the time. So while he was still officially associated with the observatory, he founded the National Weather Service. This is our new telescope, the 1904 Alvin Clark and Sons. The astronomers wanted a newer, bigger, better telescope, so they acquired this one. It was installed in the original building that was purchased or built in 1873. To assist the astronomer, they would hire a teenager. Teenager would be paid 25 cents a night to work all night for the astronomer. Teenager would have 3 jobs. The first job is to walk over to the bull rope and pulley and pull on the bull rope to open up the shutter to let the light of the moon or stars enter into the observatory dome. The second job the teenager had was to add energy to the telescope to make it work. It functions like a grandfather's clock, where you crank up the weight falls, that's kinetic energy, then the hands of the clock turn around. If 400-pound weight drops in response to gravity, that's kinetic energy. The energy is transferred by chain up to the clockworks, where a little door open. If we look into that door, that window, we see the gears are turning in the telescope. And on top of the clockworks, there is a governor. The governor has vanes and paddles on it, moving in and out and governing the speed of the telescope very precisely. Then the energy is transferred to the small gears on the bottom and the left of the door, which then transfers up the energy up the long shaft to the top of the pier, where other gears turn. Then the big 32-inch gear turns. Then the main axle of the telescope turns. And that axle is parallel to Earth's axis of rotation. Then eventually the energy is transferred to the big telescope tube, which moves across the sky at the rate of 1 revolution per day in the opposite direction that the Earth is rotating. The third job that the teenager was to assist the astronomer in turning the big metal dome, sheet metal dome, which is tons of sheet metal. There was no motors, no electricity here in 1904 when the telescope arrived. So the teenager then would use a crank on the wall, and by turning the crank, so gears and chain mechanism with the gear at the top, the big dome turns. Once you get it off a dead spot, 1 finger is enough to turn this big crank, turning tons of sheet metal. Another job that the teenager had was to assist the astronomer in aiming or pointing the telescope. To do that, you grab this top hand wheel, and by turning the hand wheel, the whole telescope moves in the north-south direction. So now the telescope lens is pointing north, low on the horizon as though you're looking at a north star. If that's the case, then look at the position where the eyepiece is, well off the floor by 20 or 30 feet. Well, the people visiting the observatory or the astronomers have to get the eye up to the eyepiece. Well, then the teenager will take the astronomer, have him walk up the steep staircase, stand him on the observing platform up there, which is actually an elevator. You can mainly push the elevator up and down. There's counterweights in the back, very easy to do, so that the eye of the astronomer is lined with the eyepiece, wherever the eyepiece happens to be positioned in the room. We're now going to go into the west wing of the Hergert building, the original 1873 building, to see where we had another observatory with a very special telescope called a Meridian Circle. This is a Meridian Circle telescope, and was in this room from about the 1887 forward. And to make it operate, astronomer would be on a couch that would roll the rails on the floor, his eye at the eyepiece of the telescope, and then it would fight on the very stars in the sky with the open slit. A different astronomer would read the time of the observation and the rest of the observation, and take those values to the office the next day and do manual, longhand, 11-place logarithmic calculations to determine basic positions of the stars. Well, the telescope then was mounted on this pier that is in the middle of the floor. It's actually on top of a pier which goes down to bedrock. And the telescope then would point to the slit in the sky. It's about 1 foot wide. So astronomers could see horizon to horizon on the north-south Meridian line. And that's a part in the sky where the stars get highest in the sky. Well, this is one of our clocks at the observatory, one of our 4 principal clocks. It's a James Ritchie, which was acquired from England and Edinburgh. And when we did the restorations of the observatory, we had the world #1 clock repair person come over from England, and he spent a couple of years restoring our 4 principal clocks. Well, our clocks have weights and pendulums, and the weights and pendulums are filled with mercury. That was the standard of the day. But this is a 1-week clock, so you have to crank up the weight. If you crank up the weight, you open up the door, use a manual crank, put it into the crank hole. Then by turning the crank, the weight goes up. Then it takes a whole week for the weight to fall down. We're all set for another week.
I hope you enjoyed John's presentation on the history of the Cincinnati Observatory. The observatory is a National Historic Landmark that was founded on and continues to exist on contributions from citizens and visitors. We function today through the generous gift of time from our many volunteers and friends of the observatory members. Financial contributions are also needed and are tax deductible. We appreciate your gift of time, talent, and treasure to preserve this historical and scientific treasure for generations to come. Thank you.
Shall I go ahead and let the credits roll, John?
Let's pull the plug.
All righty. Okay, so
You're still on your screen.
we are. All right.
There we go.
Man, I'm getting good at this Zoom stuff.
Yeah. Would like to mention that back in 2009, Cincinnati Mayor Mark Mallory proclaimed the first day of December of that year as John Ventre Day. So he's been well recognized by the city of Cincinnati for his efforts over these many years. Incredible work. Okay. I don't even see John right there. We are.
Okay.
There you are. John, I had a question. I understood that the telescope was the second largest in the world at one point.
Well, that is what we thought when we took over the observatory. And it's well recorded in history as such. But as we're doing more and more research, thanks to the web, we've now found 2 other telescopes that preceded it. They were larger, but they were more or less in private observatories. Mm-hmm. And there was not, they did not contribute much to the astronomical contribution.
I see.
Hey, John, there's a 40-inch, a 40-centimeter, I think it's a Zeiss refractor in the Republic of Georgia. And I can provide you a little bit of information in that. I was at that observatory, my wife and I, in 2017. When was it? 2015. Okay.
Okay.
And so, no, it was 17. We won't worry about it. But at any rate, I can provide you some information on that as well. So,
Yeah, I do not have anything on that one. So please, I would appreciate that very much. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Tell us about the theft.
Oh, okay.
The super sleuth, John.
Has anybody ever heard the story about the theft of the lens? In Cincinnati, we have the Cincinnati Astronomical Society, a society very similar to yours, not the one that's associated with the University of Cincinnati. But they had an Alvin Clark 8-inch lens telescope. And in October 1981, as some of our young members were using the telescope a Saturday night, they got into the observatory and noticed that the balance was out of sync. It wasn't, they took the dust cover off and noticed that the lens was missing. So someone stole the lens of the antique telescope. Well, the young fellows, they were sort of my students. They called me. I ran over to the observatory. Sure enough, the lens was missing. But there's no sign of break-in. And then they called the sheriff. The sheriff came in. And we noticed in our farmhouse meeting rooms upstairs, second floor, other items were missing. So it very appeared to be an inside job, but yet we could not identify who the culprit was. Well, over the years, I excuse me, started contacting the friends across the country who were collectors of antique telescopes, saying, hey, be on the watch. This lens is going to come on the market. Eventually, someone's going to sell a thing. And about every year, I would reattach with these gentlemen. And again, I made some great friends. And that particular body of people eventually formed the Antique Telescope Society later on in about early 1990s. And one of those fellows was Bob Ariel. And Bob is the co-author of the great book of the history of the Alvin Clark telescope. So our telescope then was lensless for a number of years, hence the observatory was not in use. We advertised a reward in various magazines, including Sky and Telescope. And a gentleman in England, see, I'm trying to remember his name, Fuller, of the Fuller Optics Company, said he had another Alvin Clark, an 8-inch. The one that was sold was 8 1/4, just a little bit smaller, but the focal length was the same or almost identical, and it could be an exchange lens. So we bought the telescope lens from England and then installed it into the telescope, and it became functional. Fortunately, we did not have to modify the telescope. All we had to do was put a adapter ring, 1/4 inch all the way around. It had fitted, and it was really an excellent lens. And it turned out to be one of Clark's lenses that was made before he opened his factory, one of the earliest of lenses. Later on, through research from Dr. Craig Woff, a historian for the Air Force, also for the Antique Telescope Society, he was doing research on Clark's pre-factory lenses and realized that our particular lens was the one that was used for the just lost the Dawes, William Dawes, the Dawes limit. That lens was used to determine the limit for Dawes. So we had a really historical lens. We didn't know it at the time when we purchased it, and it gave, again, superb images. Well, throughout the years, again, once a year, I'd contact the same old gang, and I was doing some little historical research with an astronomer in England and Bob Ariel about Clark lens. Don't remember the details. But at the end of the conversation, he said, hey, by the way, John, a friend of mine in Tennessee in the planetarium business told me that they are building a new observatory in Tennessee, and they're building it around an 1880 Alvin Clark 8-inch lens. That sounds like your lens. So I went on the track. I was able to contact the people at the college it was a new university being formed called the Roan University. And unfortunately, the director was out at the time. They gave me his name, Bob Thomas, and I was to call him back. Well, as soon as I saw the name Bob Thomas, I say, hey, wait a minute, I know somebody named Bob Thomas. He was from Dayton, Ohio, about 50 miles north of Cincinnati. And in the 70s and 80s, the two astronomical societies from Cincinnati and Dayton were very, very close. We'd attend each other's meetings and use each other's telescopes. And this particular Bob had a keen interest in antique telescopes. He had a key to the observatory, and hence it gave us suspicion that I could not call Bob because I would reveal what was going on. So I went back to Bob Ariel. I said, Bob, you call him. Tell him your association with the Clark lens. He was the Clark historian. And just shut up and see what he says. Well, the first thing out of his mouth was, my lens is not the lens that was stolen from the Cincinnati Astronomical Society. Well, right away, we knew we had him because he knew about the theft of the lens. And then also in between this period of time, I attended a math convention in Chicago. His wife was a math teacher. We met them in Chicago, coincidentally. And while there, he asked about the situation with the lens. Did we ever find it? I said, no, we never found it. And over the years, I developed, my nickname was a shoebox. I just tossed in various notes dealing with the theft of the lens. And I had on there, and I totally forgot about it, but he had called me and offered to buy our lensless telescope. He graduated from Rooster College, geology, and evidently then he got a job down in Oklahoma in the oil fields, came back to Dayton to visit his parents, came down to Cincinnati one weekend, stole the lens, took it back to Dayton and then down to Oklahoma. He had it wrapped in a towel under his bed for all these years. Well, eventually he moved to Tennessee, became a PhD, worked for the Atomic Energy Commission down there, befriended the amateur astronomers in that area, and then they started building this telescope and create this new university, and he donated the lens to build this telescope for the new university. Well, we had to disprove that he did not get the lens from Rooster College. And he had a very, very good story that early in the 1900s, Christmas time, the astronomer took the lens off of the telescope. He was going to clean it over the holidays. And during the holidays, the telescope observatory burned to the ground. And an astronomer had this lens in his desk drawer for all these years. Bob became a friend of the guy while at school. He opened his desk drawer, showed him the lens, and he said as soon as he saw it, he realized it was a Clark lens. Well, that's another lie. Just by looking at the lens, you can't tell if it's a Clark or not. Clark never marked their lenses. It was always the faceplate of the telescope that they actually marked. So he told two lies to the FBI over the having knowledge of the stolen lens, which he did have knowledge, and how he acquired the telescope. So I was fearful a little bit of revealing what we knew in case I was wrong. I didn't want to besmirch somebody's reputation. So I only told two people. One was the president of the society, and another was one of the board members who happened to be an attorney, and he practiced in law dealing with criminals. So I was doing the pick and shovel work, and then we'd put together a package, give it to John, then he would present it to the sheriff, and since it was across a state line theft, they turned it over to the FBI. So once we were positive that he had our stolen lens, the FBI went into the Roan Observatory, and they had spent over $100,000 building this observatory, building a telescope around a stolen lens. And the week the FBI showed up, the next week they were going to have the dedication of the new observatory. So this was a very special telescope for them. The FBI agents wanted to remove the lens and take it back to Cincinnati to confirm that it in fact did fit on our telescope, and Bob Thomas would not permit them to take the lens off. So one of the FBI agents took out his Swiss Army knife, opened up his little screwdriver, and started unscrewing the lens from the telescope. And Bob realized what he was doing. He said, okay, wait a minute. He went to the toolbox, got appropriate tools. He took the lens off, gave it to the FBI agents. They brought it back to Cincinnati. It fit our telescope perfectly. It was in balance, it was in focus, and all the alignment lines lined up. It was our lens, without question. At the time, we did not realize, but there was only one 8¼ inch made in 1880 of that size and that thing. So I didn't know at the time that would have been the cinch. So the sheriff then called for a press release. The sheriff was going to be running for office. This was the time, late October, and he was going to be elected again. So he thought this would be a good PR for him. And all the TV stations showed up with their cameras. And as we put the lens back on the telescope, and it just focused beautifully. So that's the story of the stolen lens.
Wow. Were there any prosecutions?
Yes. Let's see here. If I can remember my notes on that. He did not go to jail. What did he get? 3 years probation, $1,000 fine, 300 hours community service, and because he now had a felony against him, he lost his security job at the nuclear atomic. Yeah.
Wow.
We've never heard of him since.
What happened to the other 8-inch lens?
Okay. Because the Roan College was lensless, we offered the new lens, which we didn't know at the time was the better lens, yeah. To Roan, and Roan did not want to have anything to do with us. So they had a lens made for their telescope. So we had two lenses for an 1880 Alvin Clark telescope. We put the original lens on, and very soon the members realized that the older lens, the replacement lens, was much better, and it was. So we took off the original lens. It's now securely in a safety deposit box, and we're using the original, the oldest lens, the one that was used for the Dawes limit. It's a beautiful lens, yeah.
That's awesome. Was there an estimated value of that lens at the time all this was going on?
Well, when we bought the lens from England and they used that, that was around roughly around $8,000, I recall.
Jeez.
And over a period of a year, Bob's attorney was trying to throw the case out. And he said the dollar amount wasn't enough. It was under $5,000, and we were able to prove the replacement lens was over $5,000. So they threw that one out. And he had other challenges, but every challenge he brought up, the judge threw out, and he eventually got his hand slapped.
John, do you know anything about the formulation of the glass? Was there more flint in the older lens, or is there any detail of the composition of the glass that would make the smaller 8-inch lens actually better than the 8 1/4?
Don't have a good answer on that one. There are some folks in the Antique Telescope Society who are now in the process of trying to determine, especially with Clark, the composition of the glasses. Both lenses had a crown and flint, but they came from only one or two sources back then. There was very few people making that kind of thing. And so they're trying to get some chemical analyses of the lenses, which is going to take years and years and years if it ever gets accomplished. But as of today, we think the main difference was the curvature, the accuracy that Clark did with his earlier lenses before they became production lenses.
Just better figure. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a story with another telescope maker. Once they started to do volume production, their quality went way down as well. That would be Celestron.
John, I don't know if you ever heard of this. I remember when I was young, the Sky and Telescope used to have ads, and people could sell telescopes or used equipment in there. And there was, it caused enormous humor throughout the astronomy community. There was an ad in there about a stolen 6-inch lens, Alvin Clark lens, out of Massachusetts, I believe. And they were announcing this lens had been stolen. If anybody had information, to contact this observatory in Massachusetts. And the next ad, someone was selling a 6-inch Alvin Clark lens. I didn't know if it was a spoof or if it, or what, but it appeared in the same magazine.
No, I don't remember that story.
Are you still doing tours at the observatory on Sundays? And
Well, because of the virus, no, but yeah. Once that's over,
we're back to it.
Yeah, we'll go back. Sure.
Fantastic.
All of our classes with the school systems are being done Zooming. Yeah, so
Yeah.
they don't go in class anymore.
So perhaps once we get a herd immunity and get COVID behind us, we'll plan a field trip.
Oh yeah, okay.
Would you host us? Would you host us?
Yeah, then because you use the oldest, I say the oldest professional telescope in America, but
I want to
like
use
using the word public. Then we're on a safer grounds than saying professional, because there were a few, maybe about 10 telescopes with observatories that existed and being for a very short period of time. And sometimes they were associated with schools or privately owned, and they did some publications. So they kind of say they were actually professionals. So depending how you define professional, we don't want to step on their toes. So we definitely know we were the first public, or the citizens of Cincinnati paid for that telescope. So we're very safe in using that word.
John, do you know where the lens was when it was used to test the Dawes limit?
Could you repeat the last part of the question?
Yeah, the lens that was used to determine the Dawes limit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, where was it used to do that? Was it installed in a different telescope in Europe somewhere?
Yes. When Clark sold that, he sold several lenses to Dawes, and different sizes, different focal lengths. And we do have, thanks to Craig Woff now, we do have that information. And it was published in the Antique Telescope Society, one of their journals. So if you're interested, I can give you a copy of the article.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow.
John, this is Mitch.
Hello.
Hey, whenever I visit and whenever Lorraine visits, one of my favorite telescopes is the Porter Garden Scope. Could you tell them about that? It's really something. I've never seen one till then.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a good picture to bring up for you on that.
I think
So
everybody knows about the Porter Garden Scope.
Yeah, Google it if you don't quite know what it is. But it was in the 19-teens to 20s. They made these, maybe 20, approximately, if I remember the number, garden telescopes. And they were exquisite, made of statuary brass reflectors, open tube, and they would sit on a pedestal out in your garden. And they were inscribed and cast with the names of the Galileo and Newton in the base of the telescope. It's a thing of beauty, a piece of artwork in addition to a good functioning telescope. And they're quite collectible. The few that are available are very, very collectible. And we have one of the finest ones that has survived on display. And for the last 20 years, we've been trying to find out how it ended up in Cincinnati at the observatory. And there is no records whatsoever that we've able to trace back. It just showed up and we have it on displayed in a glass case. Yeah. So if and when you guys get up to Cincinnati, we'll definitely show you that telescope as well.
John, no, go ahead.
Some of you may not be aware of this, but John and I are good friends. In 1981, I was teaching high school in Cincinnati. And I was a member of the Cincinnati Astronomical Society.
That's the one where the lens was stolen. Okay.
Yeah, right about the time that I left for Nebraska, that was when the lens was stolen. I'm sorry. Didn't come after me.
Richard's got it.
I took off, but John and I, we've been good friends for all those number of years, and I owe him a lot in my career. And I never miss an opportunity when I'm in Cincinnati to go by and see that garden scope and use the Mitchell scope. And for those of you who are already eager to go, it's not without its logistical problems. By the time you rent a van and haul on over there, it's time to turn around and come back. It's really hard to do unless you spend the night in Cincinnati. So the last time we did it in a van. We left really early in the morning, went there, saw the observatory, didn't stay at night, drove back, got stuck in the fireworks that they had on Derby Day in Louisville, and didn't get home until late. So John's been eager to have us come visit, and I have been too, but the logistical issues are not insurmountable, but
Well, trying to go through Louisville during thunder didn't help.
yeah. Is that what that's called, thunder?
Thunder over Louisville, yeah.
You're right, thunder on Ohio. Or
Thunder over Louisville.
I'll tell you how bad that can be. When thunder occurs, sometimes every bridge, except this is before the new bridges were built, the Interstate Bridge, the 4th Street Bridge completely closed, and the Sherman-Minton Bridge was down to one lane and only went to Shively. You couldn't go downtown. One lane crossing the Ohio River in the entire region. So the traffic back when you probably did that was extraordinary.
No, we just parked along the side of the road and watched the fireworks.
Exactly.
But some of you asked John some questions. John is extremely knowledgeable in meteorites. He's extremely knowledgeable about antique telescopes, about the Cincinnati Observatory, and the list goes on and on and on.
John, can I ask you a question? Your work with the Antique Telescope Society, were you privy to much information about the effort to save Yerkes through them?
Superficially. They contacted us several times because they wanted to use what they would say our model of what we did to save our observatory. And I don't think in the video it really explained what we did or how we did it, but they were going to bulldoze the facility, and the amateur astronomers and one or two of the physicists at the university and some of the immediate neighbors got together, and then we formed a 501c3 not-for-profit to save the observatory. Had to raise $2.5 million to restore the facility. And Paul Knorr, Mitch would recognize him. He's the one that actually restored the telescope slightly before this occurred. And UC then turned the facility over to us. We have a 2 consecutive 40-year leases, $1 a year at our call. So it's in our hands for at least 80 years. But unfortunately, the lease is silent. What happens at the end of the 80 years?
Well, you negotiate a new one. $2 a year.
I won't be around. Yeah. So, yeah. So.
So I'm just curious, how many of you have been to the Observatory Center in Cincinnati? Oh, good.
Chuck.
I tell you, don't wait for the EAS to go. Get in your car and just go. I mean, it is the most awesome. I mean, it is the most awesome place. super organized. They got a staff there. You saw the tour. Two of the most interesting telescopes you're going to see within a day's drive of Evansville are right there. You need to check them out. Chuck tell you.
Yeah, it's
The place is really well run. I mean, it's not a fly by night operation. I mean, it is a real nonprofit organization that does tremendous educational work in the community when there's not a pandemic, and they're still doing tremendous work with the pandemic.
Yeah.
Very impressive.
Yeah, we're called the gold standard for restoring old instruments and telescopes. And we did a holistic restoration. The grounds, the buildings, the telescopes, the library, the records, the instruments. A lot of places just restore maybe a telescope or something. We did the whole thing. It's gorgeous, yeah. I forgot to mention with a stolen lens, there were some young people that night, they discovered the thing was missing, the lens was missing. Well, one of those guys was John Beretta. And John is now head of the Hubble telescope, the principal camera. He's a team leader, I believe, is his title of the Hubble telescope now. So.
John, what types of early research were done at the telescope, if any?
Little.
Being in its location.
Well, okay, we can start in when it was on Mount Adams in the early years, when it was called the Cincinnati Astronomical Society. Back then, the work was done mainly on double stars. People were doing cataloging, and whenever they saw, they would catalog. And double stars were very popular to be cataloged. Well, the number one cataloger of double stars was working out of Russia, and our observatory was situated farther south in latitude than Russia is. So Ormsby McKnight Mitchell, our founder, is the one who did the southern section of the sky that was visible from Cincinnati for his catalogs. Unfortunately, he did not publish his findings. They weren't published until he died after the Civil War. And then his replacement astronomer published the works for him. Then when they moved the observatory out to its current location called Mount Lookout, 6 miles from downtown, the work they did was positional astronomy of the stars, not discovery work. So the observatory is not known for its discoveries, but for positional astronomy of the stars. And then in the world, after World War II, it became the World Minor Planet Center, or the thousands of asteroids. They did not use the telescopes whatsoever. They were both offline for a period of time. They were useless. And the director then just used the offices to work the Minor Planet Center. And when he retired, they closed the observatory. Again, they were going to bulldoze it. And the program then was moved to Harvard. And Harvard is now doing the Minor Planet Center for us.
John, Joe's an educator at this observatory right here.
Whoa! Field trip.
We tried.
I'm in Texas. Yeah, Mitch has been here before.
You're not in Indiana then, right now.
Nope, I'm in Texas.
Oh, hello.
You're probably talking, I bet you were talking about Otto Struve, the double star.
Yes, Struve's. I think there were 5 Struves in their chain of command.
Right.
Yeah.
He was the first director of McDonald.
Who was?
Dr.
This
Otto
Struve.
Struve.
Otto?
Mm-hmm.
Really?
It was whenever we were ran by Yerkes Observatory.
Huh.
That was the second Otto, though, wasn't it? The second Otto.
Probably the second one. Yeah, not the first
Yeah.
one. The second
Oh,
one.
okay. I was going to say.
Not the first one. Otto number 2.
You had to be worried there for a minute.
Resurrected from the dead.
Right.
The weekend at Bernie's. Yeah.
But then, Chuck, going back on your question as to Yerkes, our model does not work well for them because we're in the middle of the city. So we have the people and the school kids can very easily visit us with a half hour, 20-minute bus
Right.
ride. Up there is hours and hours bus ride to go for the big cities. And they're having problems getting the school kids to come up for that reason.
Yeah, not only that, you're in Hyde Park,
Yeah.
which is the very most exclusive neighborhood in all of Cincinnati, historic wise. So, I mean, that's where you want to live. I believe the mayor was your next door neighbor for how many years?
A lot. I can't remember the exact number of years. Yeah.
It's pretty good when your observatory is the next door neighbor to the mayor. So don't get better than that.
It is a beautiful neighborhood. Yeah.
And you live in the neighborhood too, so you call it your home as well.
I live across the street from the observatory. How about that? Well, if there's no other questions, I really thank you for the invitation. I wish the video was a little bit crisper, but I think you got the message at least. Maybe to tantalize you to come up and actually visit us in person sometime soon.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'd like to also pat you guys on the back for your outreach efforts that you're doing. Chuck has sort of been filling me in, and that's what I'm about. And I'm impressed with the work that you guys are doing down there as well. So thank you very much for the work that you guys are doing.
Thank you, John. It's great seeing you and a great program. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, we've got thanks from
Thanks.
people that had to drop off early, and on behalf of the whole membership of the society, I'd like to thank you for your time that you've spent with us. I will post this video, as well as I'll set a link to your CRISP video that's on YouTube.
Okay.
On our YouTube channel. And I'll also post on our Facebook page as well. So it was a great evening. I hope you enjoyed talking to us as much.
Oh, I did. Thank you.
And being able to answer all our questions. I did look and see that 40 centimeter Zeiss was mounted in 1936. So it's a much younger, it's just a teenager compared to your Clarks.
Yeah, okay.
Babe.
Just a baby.
Hey, Tony,
Mitch,
officers and counselors, would it be possible for the officers and counselors to remain afterwards for a small bit of not necessarily business, but just talk about the possible star watches for the year?
Sure. Let me, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.